I had not realized how exhausted I was until I threw my bag into the back seat and closed the door behind me. I needed somewhere quiet, somewhere that did not ask anything from me. The week had stretched longer than it should have. Conversations ran over, small tasks piled up. Even simple decisions began to feel heavier than usual. By Friday evening, I found myself thinking about the lake cabin again. It sat 2 hours outside of town at the end of a narrow gravel road, tucked against a quiet stretch of shoreline. I had stayed there once before. No neighbors close enough to wave to, no passing traffic, just water, trees, and a small wooden structure that seemed content to be left alone. That was enough. I packed lightly, a duffel with a change of clothes, a thick sweater for the evenings, a book I had meant to finish, groceries simple enough to prepare without much thought. I moved through the house without rush, turning off lights, checking the door once before stepping outside. The drive began with the usual line of cars and red lights. Buildings stood shoulder to shoulder along the main road. Gradually, they thinned. Storefronts gave way to open stretches of land. The sky widened beyond the windshield. The further I drove, the quieter it became. The road narrowed into 2 lanes bordered by trees. Fewer cars passed in the opposite direction. The steady hum of the engine became the only sound in the car. With each mile, the week felt less immediate. Eventually, I turned onto the gravel road, marked by a small wooden sign carved with the lake's name. Dust rose lightly behind the car before settling back into place. Trees leaned inward along the narrow path, branches shifting gently in the breeze. The road curved once, then again, following the unseen line of the shoreline. Sunlight filtered through in uneven patterns across the hood. There were no houses nearby, no visible movement beyond the trees. When I reached the gate at the end of the road, I parked and stepped out. The air felt different immediately, cooler, cleaner, carrying the faint scent of pine and water. I stood there for a moment, letting myself breathe in slowly. The quiet was steady, filled only with small natural sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant movement of water against shore. I opened the gate and drove the remaining stretch toward the clearing. The trees parted gradually, revealing the lake in full. It stretched wide and still, reflecting the sky in muted tones. Near the shoreline sat the cabin, simple and weathered, with a small dock extending a short distance into the water. No boats tied nearby, no other cabins in view, just space. I pulled into the gravel clearing and turned off the engine. The sudden silence settled gently around me. I rested my hands on the steering wheel for a brief moment before stepping out. The cabin stood quietly ahead, porch empty, windows reflecting the lake's surface. A small stack of firewood was arranged neatly beside the door. The dock moved faintly with the slow rhythm of the water. I grabbed my bag from the back seat and walked toward the porch. Gravel shifted softly beneath my shoes. A bird lifted from the shoreline and crossed overhead before disappearing into the trees. As I reached the steps, I paused. The week already felt farther away than the drive suggested. I stepped onto the porch and reached for the key resting beneath the metal hook beside the door. I dropped my bag beside the door, set the cooler down near the railing, and pulled a cold beer from inside. The metal tab snapped open softly in the quiet. I took a slow sip and lowered myself into the swing chair at the edge of the porch. The wood shifted gently beneath my weight as I leaned back. From there, the lake stretched out wide and steady, its surface moving in slow, even patterns toward the shoreline. A light breeze carried across the water, cool against my face. I let the swing move slightly with my foot against the porch boards. The sun sat lower in the sky, casting long reflections across the lake that shimmered and settled with each small ripple. I took another sip and let my shoulders drop fully for the first time all day. A bird skimmed low across the lake before disappearing toward the opposite shoreline. Somewhere farther down, a fish broke the surface briefly and vanished again. The dock shifted once with the water's movement, then settled back into place. I let the swing settle and looked down toward the dock. The kayak rested where I had left it last season. The lake was calm. Small ripples moved steadily toward shore. The light had begun to soften, turning the surface of the water into long bands of silver and blue. I stood up from the swing and set the empty bottle on the porch railing. The gravel shifted lightly under my shoes as I walked down toward the dock. The air carried that familiar mix of pine and water, cool but comfortable. I stepped onto the boards and nudged the kayak the rest of the way into the water. It slid forward easily, settling with a quiet dip. The paddle felt balanced in my hands, worn smooth in the places I gripped most often. I eased myself into the seat and pushed off from the dock. The water responded gently to each stroke, parting and closing again without sound. The shoreline widened as I paddled farther from the dock, trees reflecting clearly in the surface below. The kayak glided steadily. The sun lowered another inch, light stretching across the lake in long horizontal lines. The breeze carried softly across the surface, brushing against my arms and cooling the back of my neck. I paused, paddling for a moment, and let the kayak drift. I dipped the paddle back in and turned the kayak slightly, letting it follow the shoreline at an easy pace. I needed this. It was a beautiful evening with the sun beginning to set. The fire crackled as I lit the newspaper beneath the stacked firewood. The flame caught quickly, curling around the edges before climbing into the logs. I sat back on the small stool and watched it build, steady and contained. A warm bowl of chili rested in my hands, the kind my grandmother used to make when the air turned cool. Beans, tomatoes, ground beef, a little extra cumin the way she insisted it should be. I had followed her method without changing much over the years. Some things did not need improving. I carried the bowl out to the porch and sat down, the heat from the chili rising against the evening air. The lake had grown darker as the sun settled lower, the surface reflecting the last stretch of orange near the horizon. It was quiet here. I remembered spending long summers at this cabin growing up. We would wake early and run straight to the dock, without thinking about the temperature of the water. By midday, the sun would heat the boards until we had to hop lightly across them to keep from burning our feet. We jumped from the edge of the dock over and over again, racing each other back to the ladder. Later, we would sit wrapped in towels drinking sweet tea, poured from a glass pitcher that always sweated in the heat. The days stretched long and easy, measured by how far the sun had moved, rather than by any clock. I glanced toward the tree line beside the cabin. Somewhere out there, near the edge of the clearing, I had buried a memory capsule with my cousins one summer. We had filled it with small notes, coins, and a photograph taken with a disposable camera. I could not remember exactly where we placed it. The yard had shifted over the years. Trees had grown taller. The ground looked different than it once had. I leaned back in the chair, trying to picture the angle of the sun from that day, the way we had marked the spot in our own uneven way. The fire inside the cabin settled into a steady rhythm, wood breaking down into glowing embers. The smell of smoke drifted lightly through the open door. I took another spoonful of chili and let the warmth settle. It tasted just the way I remembered. Simple, familiar, filling. I carried the empty bowl inside and set it in the sink before returning to the living room. The fire had settled into steady flames, casting a warm light across the floor. I eased down onto the couch and let my shoulders sink back against the cushions. For a moment, I simply watched the fire move. Then I reached over to the side table and picked up my old journal. The cover was worn at the edges, pages slightly curled from years of being carried back and forth between places. I had been bringing it to the cabin for as long as I could remember. I poured a glass of sweet tea and rested it beside me before opening to a page somewhere near the middle. The handwriting shifted over the years, neater in some places, rushed in others, but it all felt familiar. Out here, time moved differently. No background noise beyond the fire and the occasional shift of wind outside. My thoughts did not compete with anything. They stretched out naturally, one at a time, without urgency. I turned a page slowly, not searching for anything in particular, just reading, just sitting. The fire continued its steady rhythm. Being here made it easier to slow down. The lake, the trees, the cabin. I rested the journal open on my lap and took a sip of sweet tea, letting the quiet settle evenly around me. I leaned back into the couch and let the journal rest closed on the table. The fire shifted quietly in the hearth, wood settling into glowing embers. I took another sip of sweet tea and set the glass down beside me. The cabin carried its usual night sounds. A faint hum from the kitchen, the soft crack of wood breaking down in the fire, the floor giving a small creak as the temperature changed. I had heard those same sounds for years. I glanced toward the window. The sky had darkened completely now, the trees forming a solid outline against it. In the reflection of the glass, I could see the firelight flickering behind me. When I was younger, I used to lie on this same couch and listen to my parents talk late into the night. Their voices would drift in from the kitchen, low and steady. I never paid attention to what they were saying. It was just the sound of them being there. I picked the journal back up and opened to another page. The handwriting looked different from year to year. Some entries were short, some filled the page. I read a few lines, then paused, letting the room stay quiet around me. The tea had cooled slightly. I took another drink anyway. The fire burned lower, the light softer now. I stretched my legs out across the couch and rested my head back, listening to the steady crackle from the hearth. The lake would be dark by now. The dock would be empty. The kayak pulled halfway up on the boards. I sat there a while longer, flipping another page, then another, letting the evening move along at its own pace. I shifted slightly on the couch and reached for another log from the small stack beside the hearth. The wood felt dry and smooth against my palm. I placed it carefully onto the coals and watched as the flame caught along the edge. The light in the room lifted again, steady and warm. I adjusted the blanket around my legs and leaned back into the corner of the couch. The journal remained open on the table, a page half turned. I glanced at it, but didn't pick it up again. The fire held my attention now. Every few minutes, the wood gave a small crack as it settled. The sound didn't interrupt anything. It simply marked time. I looked toward the window again. The glass reflected the room back at me, doubling the glow of the fire. Beyond that, the night stretched across the lake, quiet and wide. I let my head rest against the cushion and stretched my legs out a little farther. The drive earlier in the day felt distant now, like it belonged to someone else's routine. The sweet tea had become warm. I finished the last of it anyway and set the empty glass aside. My eyes returned to the fire, following the slow movement of the flames as they moved through the grain of the wood. The cabin had always felt like this at night, steady, familiar, unchanged by whatever the week had carried with it. I shifted once more on the couch, settling deeper into the corner. The blanket covered my legs, one arm resting loosely at my side. The fire moved in quiet patterns, rising and lowering without urgency. I sat there for a long time, not thinking about anything specific, just watching the light move across the floorboards. The fire had burned down to a steady glow by the time my eyes began to feel heavy. The larger flames were gone now, replaced by slow pulses of orange between the logs. The room was dimmer, softer. I shifted slightly on the couch, adjusting the blanket higher across my chest. The cushion held its shape beneath me, familiar and worn in the same places it always had been. The air in the cabin felt warm and even. My eyelids closed for a moment longer than before. The fire gave a quiet crack, then settled again. Shadows moved gently along the walls, rising and falling with the embers. I opened my eyes briefly, watching the last of the brighter glow flicker against the stone. The journal still rested on the table. The empty glass sat beside it. Everything was where I had left it. I let my head turn slightly toward the hearth, the warmth reaching just far enough to keep the room comfortable. The steady rhythm of the fire replaced the movement of thoughts. There was nothing left to do tonight. No plans to consider. No list to review. Just the couch, the blanket, the quiet glow of the embers. My breathing slowed without effort. The sounds of the cabin blended together. The faint settling of wood, the low hum from the kitchen, the small shift of the fire as another log eased deeper into the coals. I did not mean to fall asleep. I only meant to close my eyes for a minute. The orange glow dimmed gradually, softening into a low shimmer. The ceiling above me faded into shadow. The warmth from the hearth lingered in the room. My hand rested loosely against the cushion. The blanket rose and fell gently with each breath. The last visible ember flickered once more before settling into a steady red. Somewhere in the distance, a small ripple moved across the lake outside, unseen in the dark. Inside, the cabin remained still. The embers shifted again, a soft orange glow moving beneath the surface of the logs. I opened my eyes and watched it for a while, following the slow changes in the light. The room had grown darker, but the fire still held the center of it. I adjusted the blanket once more, tucking it around my shoulder. The couch felt warm from sitting there so long. I stretched my legs out and flexed my toes slightly beneath the fabric before letting them rest again. The cabin had settled for the night. The faint hum from the kitchen remained steady. Every so often, the floor gave a small, familiar creak. The air felt even and calm. I glanced toward the window. The glass reflected only the dim outline of the room now. The lake beyond it had disappeared into the dark. My eyes returned to the fire. The movement was slower now. The flames no longer climbed high. Instead, they traced the edges of the wood in quiet lines before sinking back into the coals. A thin thread of smoke rose and faded into the chimney. I shifted onto my side, pulling the blanket closer under my chin. The couch cushion dipped slightly beneath the change in weight. I let my arm rest beneath my head. The drive earlier that day felt distant. The gravel road, the gate, the porch swing, the kayak gliding across the lake. They passed through my thoughts gently, without staying long. The fire gave another soft crack. I blinked slowly, watching the glow rise and fall. The room felt warmer near the hearth, cooler toward the hallway. I considered getting up to add another log, but stayed where I was. My eyes closed again. The light pressed faintly through my eyelids, orange and dim. The sound of the embers settling blended into the steady quiet of the cabin. My breathing matched the slow rhythm of the room. I opened my eyes one more time and looked at the fire. It had lowered further, the brightest flames gone now. Only a bed of red coals remained, steady and low. The edges of the logs had turned pale where the heat had worn them down. I shifted once more, settling deeper into the corner of the couch. The blanket covered most of me now. My hand rested loosely along the cushion. The air felt still. Another few minutes passed. The coals dimmed gradually, their glow fading from bright orange to a softer red. The shadows along the wall softened with them. My thoughts moved slower. The lake would still be there in the morning. The dock, the kayak resting against the boards, the trees lining the shore. The fire lowered again. The room grew darker. My breathing deepened. The last visible ember pulsed faintly before settling into a quiet glow.